Hi everyone, thank you for tuning in to my Vilnius Academy module on unconscious bias and what we can do about it. What we're going to do in this module is talk a little bit about what unconscious bias is and where it comes from, and then we'll discuss briefly why it's important, and then what we can do about it, and some sort of next steps from after there, why it matters in the EYP context. So what is unconscious bias? Well, unconscious bias arises from the fact that the mind can be broadly split into two types. We have an unconscious mind and we have a conscious mind. The unconscious mind is important. It's really useful because it can process an awful lot more information than the conscious mind can. And the reason why it's able to do that is that it draws on our background, it draws on our past experience, and it draws on our cultural environment to make nearly instantaneous decisions. This is really important because if we didn't have an unconscious mind, if we had to use our conscious mind all the time, which tends to use analysis and rational thinking instead, then we just wouldn't be able to make decisions. We'd sort of get paralyzed by thinking through everything and would just become an overload. So the mind filters certain decisions into the unconscious mind, into the conscious mind, and they make decisions in different ways. One drawing on past experiences and sort of using instinct, the other on using analysis. So that's kind of how the mind works. The problem is that when decisions actually need rational thought, and when they're made in the unconscious mind will often get it wrong. And that's because the unconscious mind uses instinct and it uses past experiences to make the decision. And as you can imagine, if it's using past experiences or if it's using, for example, our cultural environment or our background to make decisions, then the chances are the unconscious mind is probably biased. And this is where the problem arises. So how does it work? Well, basically the unconscious mind makes snap judgments of the people that we meet, for example, and it will tend to judge people on the basis of their gender, their race, or their socioeconomic background. So you've probably heard the phrase that it's really important to make a good first impression on people, and that first impressions matter. This is part of where that comes from. The reason why first impressions matter is that the unconscious mind is making a snap decision about the people that we meet. It's using past experiences and cultural background to make that decision, but it's not actually making the decision on any information of the person that we've just met. So you can see why there's limitations to the unconscious mind making snap judgments, but it does it anyway. And this judgment then ends up in our mind, it seeps into our unconscious mind, and it influences the way we think about other people. The unconscious mind also tends to judge whether people are like us and whether they're part of what would be referred to as our in-group. So we may tend to prefer people who are in our in-group. It could be people of the same gender, people of the same nationality, people of the same background. If we feel more comfortable with people in that in-group, and if our experiences of people with our in-group are preferable. So as an example, potentially men may favor men if they are doing a job interview, because if they associate with them as being in their in-group, then they have a preference for men. Equally, we may actually have a preference for people in our out-group if we think that people in the out-group are, for example, more powerful than the in-group that we are in. So the way this may work is that potentially women may favor men for a job if they think that men are in a more powerful group, or if they actually are in a more powerful group. So this can work in strange ways. It's not always a case of identifying with people in our in-group or in our out-group. It's more a case that we are making these sort of unconscious associations with particular groups based on the impression that we have of those groups rather than on any rational thinking. Now, of course, the problem with unconscious bias is that everybody has it and it colors our decisions, but often without us realizing it. So, for example, there's a lot of research that shows that people pay more attention to a male voice. There's no good reason to pay more attention to a male voice, but our unconscious mind is giving the male voice in an awful lot of people sort of a preferential treatment rather than a female voice. And of course, not everybody has this type of unconscious bias. So unconscious bias manifests itself differently in different people. But what is clear is that it's there for everyone, and it affects the decisions that we make. And ideally, it wouldn't. I think that goes without saying. So we can kind of guess why unconscious bias matters in society more generally, but I think what this slide wants to get at is why would unconscious bias matter in EYP? And I think, and this is something to think about in your own time and to maybe discuss with other people at the session, but I think that there's probably two ways that it impacts on EYP. One is it affects the way that we interact with our delegates as chairs, and it probably also affects how our delegates interact with us. So for example, how does it affect the way that we interact with our delegates? You may have a delegate who is very, very strong in team building, and you get this great impression of this delegate. You think, yeah, this delegate's really strong. He or she made a great contribution to solving that game. I'm sure they're going to be great in committee work. And then they go into committee work and maybe they're not quite as strong in committee work. It turns out that they are not as well prepared for committee work as they might be, but they're still speaking up a lot and they're making points. Those points may not be particularly strong because they haven't done that much research of the topic. But in your unconscious mind, because you're making impressions, or because your impressions of this person are made on the basis of past experiences, you've had a very positive past experience with them in team building, and then that flavors the way you think about their performance in committee work. So you may think, oh, they're doing quite a good job in committee work, because your unconscious mind is making a snap decision and a snap judgment on their performance in committee work based on past experiences of how they've done, rather than what's actually in front of you. It's not thinking analytically about what it sees, it's not making a rational decision. That's one example. Another example may be that you have a delegate in your committee who isn't very strong with English. They don't have particularly good English language skills, but they have some excellent points to make. And when they're making their points in committee work, you may have an unconscious bias against them because your unconscious mind equates not being able to speak English very well with not being particularly intelligent or not being able to make good points. So consequently, even though your delegate is actually making some excellent points, because they're struggling to make the point and because they're struggling to explain the point, you may unconsciously be thinking it's not really a very valid point, and you and your fellow delegates, of course, this is the other problem, the people on the committee may not be listening that much to the point that the delegate is making. In how it affects the way that delegates interact with us, it could be things like, for example, the body language that you use around your delegates could be part of what affects the judgment that delegates make of you. So you may be in committee work one day and you may be looking detached. It may not look like you may not be very involved in the discussion. You may be sitting in the corner of the room, which I've done quite a lot and which a lot of chairs do. We often quite like to detach ourselves from the discussion. That's perfectly fine. But your delegates in their unconscious mind may use that as a way of thinking, oh, they may think my chair isn't particularly interested in the discussion that is going on. Or maybe you actually do have poor body language, or the body language doesn't look very positive. And as a result of that, your delegates start to make decisions and make impressions of you and your level of engagement with the committee without actually thinking it through properly and without thinking it through on a rational basis. They make an instinctive judgment which is formed in the unconscious mind. And I'm just thinking there's something else that you could add to this slide, and it's that unconscious bias obviously also affects how delegates interact with delegates and potentially how officials interact with officials, and in the same kind of way. You could imagine a delegate on a committee who is struggling to make a point not being listened to by the other delegates because they think this person can't make the point very well, therefore we're not going to consider it all that deeply, and potentially that happens, I'm sure it happens on an interofficial level as well. So there's many ways that this can affect the EYP experience, and I'm sure there's plenty more examples that we could find of that, so worth thinking of some of those. Then that leaves us with the question of how can we deal with our unconscious bias? Because you can't cure unconscious bias. It's there, everybody has it. So the question that we then need to answer is, what can we do about it? How can we limit its impact? One, I think, really useful thing to do is to think about the type of unconscious biases that you may have. Generally, people have different types of unconscious bias because we have different backgrounds, we have different cultural environments, and we have different experiences. And so therefore, we all have different types of unconscious bias. Consequently, it's worth thinking about the type of unconscious bias that you have. Once you've actually identified the type of unconscious bias that you have, you can then take steps to be aware of it, and once you're aware of it, then you can think about, when you're making a decision, is the unconscious bias that I know I have, is that affecting the decision that I'm making here? Now, there are a lot of online tests to facilitate this. The most famous is there's a test which researchers in Harvard University have put together. I had a go at that this afternoon and I didn't find it great. The reason is that I think they ask particular questions, and because you can only choose between 5 different answers, some of the nuance in the answer is lost. So, for example, one of the questions is, do you think that young girls, when they are growing up, should learn how to cook and how to clean? And you can imagine that if you say, yes, I think they should, then you will get the result that, oh, you have an unconscious bias against girls and women in the house. But my answer to that question would be, yes, girls should learn how to cook and how to clean the house when they are growing up, and so should boys. And everyone should have this essential life skill, and there shouldn't be distinction or differentiation between the two. There isn't an option to put in that answer. So I personally found the test a little bit frustrating, and I think it has its limitations, and there's been some research on the limitations of these types of tests. But you may want to try one, you may find one that's quite good, and it may even just be helpful as a way of getting you thinking through the types of unconscious bias that are out there. But I do think an important first step for dealing with unconscious bias is to identify the types of unconscious bias that we have. The second is then to challenge your thinking, and to try to generate judgments based on rational thinking in the conscious mind. So if you have sort of come to a conclusion about a delegate, or if you have an impression in your mind, it's worth stopping and thinking, where does that impression come from? What's the foundation for that? What's the basis for the judgment that I've just come to? And can I draw on examples? Can I, analytically think this through, and for the decision to still stand up and to still be effective? And ultimately, if you can't justify your impression on the basis of analysis, then the chances are the impression was made by the unconscious mind and it's probably biased. So we need to challenge our thinking, and we need to show a process by which we've come to a conclusion, which is sort of analytically a bit more sound. And one way that we might be able to do that is to use other chairs on the board to actually challenge our thinking. So one thing which is quite, which I've thought is quite interesting at national and regional sessions where we have a jury at the session, is how frequently the jury will have a different impression of a delegate than a chair may have, for right or for wrong. And part of that is because the jury has seen the delegate at different times or in different lengths, hasn't seen as much of the delegate as the chair would have had. But part of it may also as well be because we have different unconscious biases, and the jury member may not have the kind of unconscious bias the chair has, or vice versa. Using other people, using other officials at the session to challenge the kind of thinking, the kind of conclusions that you've reached may help to reveal some of the unconscious bias that you have, and then help you to actually come up with a conclusion which is somewhat more based on analysis, if you will. But I think it's a really important thing to do, and I think it's particularly important in the context of chairs facilitating committees, making sure that all of the delegates are involved, making sure that we give everyone a chance, but also in particular writing good evaluations at the end of the session. I think that this unconscious bias probably, I'd say definitely, colours the types of evaluations that we write, and that's inevitable. It's kind of hard to get around that. But if we want to make sure that we give fair and accurate evaluations of our delegates, then I think it's important to actually think through the conclusions that we've reached on our delegates and the impressions that we've reached of our delegates to make sure that we get to a fair and impartial and analytical evaluation of the delegate, which is based on good thinking in the conscious mind rather than in the unconscious mind. And I think that's particularly important in the context of making EYP a diverse and an open organisation. Potentially the unconscious biases that we have are leading us to write evaluations that don't fully reflect the potential capabilities of delegates from less represented backgrounds. And maybe that's part of the reason, is that our unconscious biases are getting in the way of the things that we do. So I think this matters. I think it's quite important. And in sum, what I would say here is think about the types of unconscious bias that you may have. Think about how unconscious bias can manifest itself in EYP, in the different interactions that different people have with each other, and what we can do about that, how we can manage our own and other people's unconscious bias at the session. And then think a little bit, as I say, about dealing with that for yourself and for other people as well. This is something we can pick up on at the session as well, to think about more examples or more ways of dealing with it. But obviously, if you want to chat about this, very happy to discuss, and any board member, and I'm sure fellow chair as well, may have experience with this or may have thoughts on it as well. So hopefully this presentation will have got you thinking. We'll start the discussion a little bit and will help us to think about ways that we can deal with and control that unconscious bias. Thanks for listening.